July 29, 1948, Hamelin Prison, West Germany. The same gallows, the same executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, the British hangman who had executed Irma Grace at this exact prison nearly 3 years earlier, on December 13, 1945. The same cold stone corridors. A different woman. She was 28 years old, younger than almost anyone else the Allies had hanged for war crimes at this facility. She had been a concentration camp guard for exactly 8 months. 8 months, from July 1944 to March 1945. And in those 8 months, in 2 camps connected by a short road in northern Germany, she had personally participated in decisions that led to the deaths of thousands of women and children. At her trial, when the British military court asked her to respond to the charges, she did something almost no other female SS guard had ever done in any war crimes proceedings since the war ended. She confirmed them. All of them. She told the court exactly what she had done, in her own words, in a statement that has been cited by historians ever since as one of the most extraordinary confessions of the entire post-war trial period. This is the story of Ruth Neudeck, and what she said when she finally had to account for it. Ruth Neudeck was born on July 5, 1920, in Breslau, a city in what was then Germany, now the Polish city of Rokow. She came from a working-class family. Her father worked in a trade. Her childhood left almost no trace in the historical record. There are no accounts of early radicalization, no documented engagement with Nazi ideology, no particular markers of the person she would become. She finished her basic schooling, worked ordinary jobs in ordinary circumstances, and for the first 23 years of her life was, by every available account, entirely unremarkable. This is important to understand, because what happened next was not the result of a lifetime of ideological preparation, or a particularly unusual background. It was the result of a single decision made in a specific moment in response to a specific opportunity. In July 1944, the SS was actively recruiting women to serve as auxiliary guards at concentration camps. The war had been going badly since Stalingrad in early 1943, and the demand for camp personnel had outpaced the available supply of recruits. Financial incentives were offered. Positions were advertised, and Ruth Neudeck, 23 years old, working an ordinary job, living through a war that was reshaping everything around her, applied. She was accepted. She arrived at Ravensbrück, the all-female concentration camp north of Berlin, in July 1944 to begin her training as a camp guard. Ravensbrück was, by 1944, one of the largest and most established camps in the entire SS system. It had been operating since 1939. Tens of thousands of women had passed through it. It was the primary training facility for female SS auxiliaries. The place where women like Irma Grace had been shaped into the kinds of guards the system required. Ruth Neudeck arrived there as a trainee. What the camp did to her, or revealed about her, became apparent almost immediately. She was promoted to Blockview Herren, barrack overseer, within weeks of her arrival. In a system where promotion was based on demonstrated performance, that speed told its own story. What was she doing to earn promotion that fast? Survivor testimony from Ravensbrück described her as one of the cruelest guards in the camp within months of her arrival. She beat prisoners. She targeted the weakest and most vulnerable. One account that has been cited in multiple historical sources described her dragging dying women outdoors during roll calls and kicking them off the chairs or benches that had been supporting them, deliberately hastening the deaths of people who were already near the end. She was not doing this under direct orders for each specific act. She was doing it because it was what the system rewarded, and because nobody above her was telling her to stop. Then, in December 1944, 5 months after arriving at Ravensbrück, Ruth Neudeck was promoted again. She was given the rank of Oberaufseherin, senior supervisor, and transferred to a facility just down the road from Ravensbrück. The facility was called Uckermark, and what Uckermark was in December 1944 was something entirely different from what it had been even 6 months earlier. From 1942 to 1944, Uckermark had been a camp for girls, specifically, a detention facility for German girls aged 16 to 20, one who had been classified by the regime as socially deviant, difficult, or criminal. Approximately first 200 girls had been held there at various points. Then, in January 1945, the regime made a decision that transformed the facility entirely. Uckermark was converted into a killing center, a satellite extermination site for Ravensbrück. Its new purpose was to receive women from the main camp who had been identified as no longer able to work. Women too ill, too old, or too broken by the conditions of Ravensbrück to continue as a productive labor force. Women sent to Uckermark from January 1945 onward were not sent there to recover or to be reassigned. They were sent there to be gassed. Ruth Neudeck arrived to take charge of this facility as its chief warden at exactly the moment this transformation was taking place. If you are hearing this and finding it difficult to absorb, that is the right response. Hit the like button. This history needs to be told, and it needs to be remembered. What happened at Uckermark under her supervision is documented not from second-hand accounts or fragmentary evidence, but from her own words. At her trial before the British military court in Hamburg in April 1948, Ruth Neudeck gave a statement that became one of the most cited confessions in the entire series of Ravensbrück war crimes proceedings. She said, and these are her own words, recorded in the court transcript. As I took over the Uckermark camp, there were approximately 4,000 prisoners of all nationalities present. When I was reposted approximately 6 weeks later, only 1,000 prisoners remained. During my activity, approximately 3,000 women were selected for the gas chamber. Read that back slowly. 4,000 prisoners when she arrived, 1,000 when she left, 3,000 selected for the gas chambers. By her own account, in her own words, in front of a court that was deciding whether she would live or die. She did not claim she had been forced to do it. She did not claim she had no choice. She stated the numbers as facts because they were facts and because denying them would have been pointless given the evidence assembled against her. But the selections were not the full extent of what survivor testimony documented at her trial. Witnesses described her personal behavior at Uckermark in detail that goes beyond administrative participation in a killing process. She beat prisoners individually. She targeted people who were already dying, hastening their deaths through deliberate physical violence during the roll calls that the camp held even for its most severely weakened inmates. One documented incident, cited in testimony from a former French prisoner named Geneviève de Gaulle, Anthonioz, the niece of Charles de Gaulle, who had been arrested for her work in the French resistance and sent to Ravensbrück, described what she had personally witnessed Neudeck do to one prisoner. De Gaulle. Anthonioz testified that she had seen Neudeck use the sharp edge of a shovel to cut the throat of an inmate. Not a weapon, not a gun, a tool, a shovel with its metal edge drawn across a human throat. Geneviève de Gaulle. Anthonioz was not a marginal witness. She was the niece of the man who had led Free France. She survived the camp, returned to France, became a prominent social activist, and was eventually awarded France's highest civilian honor, the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor. She died in Paris in 2002. Her testimony, given after the war and recorded as part of the historical documentation of Ravensbrück, has never been seriously challenged. Other witnesses described additional patterns of behavior. Prisoners who were selected for the gas chambers were told, with deliberate cruelty, that they were being taken somewhere warm, a tactic designed not for comfort, but for easier movement of people who might otherwise resist or flee. Neudeck was documented as being directly involved in dragging selected prisoners by the hair to the transport, lorries that would take them to the gas chambers, taunting them as she did it about the warmth that awaited them. This was not bureaucratic distance from the killing process. This was personal, physical, intimate participation in the last moments of people's lives. The trial that finally brought Ruth Neudeck before a court was the third Ravensbrück trial, held before the British military court in Hamburg between April 14th and April 26th, 1948. 5 women officials from Uckermark were charged. 2 of them, Lotte Toberentz and Johanna Brauch, were acquitted. The court found that they had worked at Uckermark only during the period when it was still a camp for girls, before the conversion into a killing centre, and there was no evidence linking them to the deaths of Allied nationals. The remaining 3 were convicted. Elfriede Monaik, the assistant chief warden, received 10 years imprisonment. Marguerite Rabe, a junior warden, received a life sentence, later commuted. And Ruth Neudeck, the chief warden, the woman who had arrived to find 4,000 prisoners and left 6 weeks later with 1,000, was condemned to death. She had confessed. The court had found her guilty. There was no appeal that would have changed what was coming. On July 29, 1948, Albert Pierrepoint, the British hangman who had by that point executed dozens of Nazi war criminals, including Irma Grace, including the Bergen, Belsen guards, including dozens of others across multiple trials, came to Hamelin prison and performed another execution. Ruth Neudeck was hanged. She was 28 years old. 2 of her co-defendants at the Uckermark trial, Toberentz and Braque, the 2 who had been acquitted, went on to work in the West German police force after the war. This detail, noted in passing in several accounts of the trial, carries the kind of weight that summary cannot fully convey. 2 women who had worked at a camp that was converted into a killing centre, who were acquitted because there was insufficient evidence linking them to the deaths of Allied nationals specifically, went on to serve in law enforcement in the country that had produced the camps they had worked in. They lived ordinary lives. They died of ordinary causes. Their names appear in footnotes. Ruth Neudeck does not appear in footnotes. She appears in the court record of the 3rd Ravensbury Sakai trial, in her own confession, in the testimony of Genevieve v. de Gaulle, Anthonio's, and in the execution records of Hamelin prison. She volunteered for this work at 23. She was promoted for demonstrating ferocity within weeks of arriving. She took charge of a killing centre at 24 and oversaw the systematic murder of approximately 3,000 women by her own account. She was hanged at 28 by a man who had hanged Irma Grace at the same prison 3 years earlier. She never explained why she volunteered. She never said in any surviving account what she thought about during the 6 weeks at Uckermark, when the population dropped from 4,000 to 1,000. She simply told the court the numbers, confirmed the accusations, and waited for the sentence. Whether that was honesty or resignation, or something that cannot be named from the outside, nobody who was in that courtroom recorded. What Genevieve v. de Gaulle, Antonio's did after surviving the camp that Ruth Neudeck helped run is, in some sense, the rest of this story. She spent decades working on behalf of people living in extreme poverty. She founded and led organizations. She campaigned for the recognition of economic and social rights at the United Nations level. She wrote a memoir about her time at Ravensbury titled The Dawn of Hope. She received the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor. She died in 2002, aged 81, in Paris. She had been in the same camp at the same time as the woman who cut a prisoner's throat with a shovel. One of them was hanged in 1948. The other one spent the rest of her long life making the world slightly better than she had found it. If you want to hear the story of the woman who ran the entire Ravensbrück Psyche system, the SS Oberofficerin who trained the guards, set the standards, and oversaw the women who became names on this channel, that story is coming next on Ordinity. Subscribe so you don't miss it.